But if we go back to the forest as the model, it's so productive, so effective. There's so much, no other ecosystem that's based on land can produce more biomass in one season than the forest. So yeah, why not just replace the trees in this forest, for instance? It's the deciduous forest from in Germany where I grew up. It's mostly beech, some maple trees, lime trees, tilia, and so on. So there's some of them are food crops in a certain respect. And this is in this place it's a natural forest, and this is the most productive ecosystem that can exist given the prerequisites in this place right now. It's very productive. It's maybe 150 years old, this forest. It could be much older. Of course, it was clear cut in the 1800s when people needed firewood. So probably it's going to become even more productive. But there's not a lot of food in here. So this productivity that the forest displays is like total biomass productivity. That's leaves and it's wood, it's roots, timber basically you can say, branches and so on and so forth. But it's not biomass that's meant for human consumption. So even if we replaced all these trees with say walnuts and pecan trees and chestnuts, whatever works in this climate, yeah, it would be out of reach. And the crowns of these trees they're really high up, really small. And nut trees and fruit trees, they need big crowns to produce a lot of fruit. They need lots of light. And there's not a lot of light. It's very productive, but there's not a lot of light. So that's why there's not a lot of human biomass production that we can use as a foodstuff. So we have to kind of really leave the forest as a model, this kind of forest at least. We can very much be inspired by the mechanisms that create this ecosystem, but if we want to get food from a food forest, we can't think in these terms, and even less so in a coniferous forest with spruce that's really dark. There's like no light coming down to the bottom layer. But luckily there's more models, natural models that we can use. They're not going to be as productive as the forest is, and when it comes to total biomass production, but they're going to be very productive from a human foodstuff perspective. But we can also note that when we back off the forest, which is totally self-sustaining, doesn't need any human input, it's perfect on its own. But when we leave the forest as a model, we're going to have to become more active. It means work. So it's not a work-free garden. That's kind of what I thought with these, throwing out those carrot seeds and planting all these trees. Like, yeah, I'm just going to walk in there and harvest. It's not that easy. I was a bit naive, I guess. So I also look at other natural models, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them now before I go into more abstract examples of how we can use the forest as a model. So the forest structure-wise like this is not a good model, but there's a lot of things we can learn from the forest anyway. And one of the ecosystems that is most interesting to me, which I use most when I, both in my own garden, but also when I design gardens for other people, is the forest edge. And a lot of the trees, the perennial crops that we grow today, they really thrive in a forest edge environment. If you take plums, you can take rose hips, hazelnuts even. They can grow in deep shade, hazelnuts, but they're just waiting for the next disturbance. They maybe are growing underneath a big oak tree or fir tree, and hazelnuts can become really old, several thousand years actually. And once this big tree falls, the hazelnut gets lots of light and can produce lots of nuts. In shady conditions, the hazelnut's not going to produce very many nuts, maybe no nuts at all for centuries. And then suddenly there's a disturbance, a fire, whatever happens, a storm, and the hazelnut produces stuff. So if you put the hazelnut on the forest edge, it's going to produce more, of course. That's in those conditions where many of those plants that we think of kind of forest species, that's where they produce and reproduce. And it's really their reproductive organs that we eat, you can say. So we want to give them the best prerequisites to be able to produce. And I'm not talking about this modern forest edge, the man-made forest edge, which is created by either animals, grazing animals, or a tractor that's kind of, you have the forest and it just stops. It's a 90-degree angle, and then you have a grassland or a field or something like that. That's what most people, including me, would call a forest edge nowadays. But a natural forest edge is much longer, like this one you can see here. It's not the best picture, but it's pretty close to our forest garden. I kind of walk past there every day and look at it and look at the dynamics that are happening in this forest edge. It's not very productive from a total biomass perspective, but even in this natural forest edge, there's a lot of production happening in the form of raspberries and rowan berries, and also what do you call them, elderberries, for instance, and a lot of stuff that's not edible. And this is how the forest reconquers open land. So if there's been a flood or a drought or a fire or big grazing animals coming through, this is how the forest recovers that land. It's exactly what we saw on the first picture, where you have this last patch of grassland in the middle and the forest is kind of coming from the sides, creating this sloping, long forest edge. And that's the forest edge is warmer than the forest. There's more heat that's being trapped basically on the forest edge, and it's also warmer than the open field, where there's a lot of wind that kind of redistributes the warm air. So we have much better growing conditions for many of the crops we already today grow, many of the perennial crops. And one place in Sweden that's been working a lot with the forest edge as a model or a blueprint for a forest garden is Holma Forest Garden in the south of Sweden, outside Lund. Anyone who's been there by any chance? Yes, quite a few. More than yesterday when I was 2 days ago when I was in Uppsala. The Holma Forest Garden was started in 2004 as an EU project, and two of the people who started this, they've been my mentors in this forest gardening trip that I've been on the last 10 years or something, and they kind of were facing the same question: why don't we grow food in a different way? Why do we have to create open soil to be able to grow food? And they really wanted to try this, take it from Britain, where they had seen this in action at Martin Crawford's place, and wanted to trial this in the very cold south of Sweden. This is growing zone 2 in Sweden, so it would be 1 in Finland, so it's quite mild. Not very representative really for the rest of Sweden, but still they grow a lot of stuff that we can grow in our growing zone as well. And here you see this artificial forest edge that they created with apples, which is also a forest edge. At least the wild European apple is a forest edge species, kind of moving along the forest edge as the landscape is changing and evolving. Hazelnut that I've talked about a bit, raspberries in front of that, a typical forest edge species that's also moving along, trying to run away from its own diseases. So that's why we shouldn't have them in one place all the time. We should let them run around a bit. And then sweet Sicily has just one perennial I wanted to point out, which is a quite big, sturdy perennial. Tastes anise seed, basically. The whole plant is edible and quite interesting if you like that taste. And then the edge continues, the pathway that I'm standing on when I take this picture. It goes right through the forest edge. It's kind of a steep forest edge, but still wide enough to accommodate for quite a few species. And we also have sweet rowan here in the back. And this forest edge is really productive. Tons of raspberries, tons of hazelnuts, tons of apples, tons of sweet rowan being produced. And then in between we have all these different perennial vegetables and some more functional species that are growing there. And are you familiar with sweet rowan by any chance? Anyone who's?
Yeah, people.
Yes, sounds good. Yeah, it's probably true. It's this one. You also get the botanical name here. It's a species that is really interesting for the colder parts of Scandinavia and Finland. That's not really Scandinavia, is it? You told me once it's not Scandinavia.
No, it's not.
Yeah, what is it?
It's in Nordic,
in the Nordic
region.
Nordic region. Thanks, Nordic region. All right. Sweet rowan. It's a natural mutation of the ordinary rowan, which is really astringent and bitter, not very tasty. It's not poisonous, but it's not tasty. And this has occurred in a bunch of places around the world. In the Czech mountains, Moravia, I think it's called, that part of the Czech Republic. There are a few cultivars that were selected from the wild, were found in the wild, and then propagated by Eastern German gardeners. The color doesn't really show properly here. bright red. There's also a forest outside of Moscow where they found sweet drawings. And I wouldn't say they're sweet, they're quite acidic, but they're not bitter at least. They've totally lost this bitter, whatever it's called, I forget the name of the substance. And you can dry them, for instance, like you dry raisins, and it's the same nice, juicy crunchiness that you find in good raisins when you dry them properly. It's really nice. It's a bit of work to clean them though, to take away those stems that are behind us, on the back of the berries. So what we do in my family, we make fruit leather out of them. So we cook, we just take all the berries with all the leaves and everything. We don't clean them at all. We boil them up with a little bit of water just to create some hot steam basically that breaks up the walls of the skin. And then we have this what's called the Moulinex sieve, I think, in English. You kind of grind, and it's the fruit is being pressed through a sieve basically, and what's left is this compote basically. The inner parts of this, no seeds, no leaves, nothing. And then we put this in an oven in our bad oven it takes 24 hours, in a good oven maybe 6 hours, and then what you get after that period of time is nice, tasty fruit leather. It's really holds together nicely and has this candy kind of feeling to it, but there's no sugar added, and it tastes even better than the berry does once you do the fruit leather. And I have to lock this in. My kids, when they see me making fruit leather, or we make this together nowadays, I tell them this is for winter when we don't have any fresh fruit. And then they ask like, late September, when's winter coming in? So we can open the fruit leather jars. So we do a lot of this, not just on sweet drawings, but that's really the best way to use this fruit, in my opinion, to make fruit leather from it.